On July 20th, 1969, the USA declared victory in the space race. But was it real?
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
6% of Americans firmly believe it never happened, and some even believe it was a hoax orchestrated in true Hollywood fashion.
The winner is Stanley Kubrick. Mr. Kubrick unfortunately cannot be with us tonight, so we'll have his Oscar delivered to Mars, where he is scouting locations for 2002 Space Odyssey Revisited.
Could the US really have pulled off such a high-stakes and public hoax? And if so, who really directed the moon landing? One small step for man, one annoying light to burn my skull in. The moon landing conspiracy has always been an interesting one to me because I think, honestly, it's not one that I am hugely ever found that intriguing. It seemed like all of the evidence towards it was flimsy at best. But there has been some interesting questions raised, and to be honest as well, if you were to ask me to explain why I think it was false, I couldn't have really told you. So I wanted to really dive into this and see it with an open mind and figure out what I think by the end of the research. As I discussed in the last one, conspiracy theories always seemed a bit wacky until a few of them started to be obviously true, like JFK, for example. So if JFK's assassination is likely, in my mind, a real conspiracy theory, then what's to say the moon landing being fake isn't either? Well, let's find out with the evidence. It's July 20th, 1969. Nearly 500 million people around the world watch in awe as Neil Armstrong steps off Apollo 11's lunar module and proclaims,
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
the moon landing is a triumph of science and human spirit, but almost as quickly as the applause erupts, whispers of doubt begin. Did this really happen, or was it an elaborate fake? In the decades since, an enduring conspiracy theory has grown around Apollo 11 and subsequent moon landings. Opinion polls, even as late as 2001, show that a significant minority of people, between 6 and 20% of Americans, believe the moon landings were faked. The notion sounds impossible, yet it persists in our collective imagination. But how did this conspiracy theory begin? Well, in the mid-1970s, as trust in government eroded in the post-Vietnam and Watergate era, a man named Bill Kaysing lit the spark. In 1976, Kaysing, a former US Navy officer and technical writer for a NASA contractor, self-published We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle. This book, filled with allegations that Apollo's missions were a giant fraud, effectively launched the public discussion of a moon landing hoax. Kaysing had no aerospace expertise, yet he claims the odds of a successful moon landing were astronomically low, just 0.0017% by his reckoning, and that NASA found it easier to fake the moon landings than to actually go. His suspicions resonated with a cynical public climate. Simply put, if the government could lie about everything else, why not lie about the moon landings? From there, the conspiracy theory took roots of its own.
The hallmark of America's space program since the first Mercury launch, as all of us Americans know, has been its openness. a conscientious effort on the part of NASA to let the American people share in this incredible adventure.
By the 1980s, the Flat Earth Society was accusing NASA directly of this, saying that Walt Disney himself had built the stages, Arthur C. Clarke wrote the script, and Stanley Kubrick had directed. Around the same time, pop culture stoked the imagination. The 1978 film Capricorn 1 portrayed a fake Mars landing, feeding the idea that NASA could have hoaxed this. In fact, in 2001, 3 decades later, Fox TV network aired a sensational documentary.
I know you know Alex Jones.
I used to be a moon landing denier. I used to believe totally that we never went to the moon, because there was a documentary that came on Fox. Yes, trust me.
No,
Fox,
I didn't Google you hard enough before I came on.
In the 1990s, Fox had a show called Conspiracy Theory: Did We Go to the Moon? And they aired it on television prime time, and they got me hook, line, and sinker.
Tonight, we investigate the most extraordinary event of the 20th century. Man landing on the moon. But believe it or not, some people say it never happened. Conspiracy theory. Did we land on the moon?
So let's dive into where this comes from, where the seeds of doubt began to grow from, and what evidence there is for a moon landing conspiracy. What evidence would make us think that the moon landings didn't take place when so many people were involved, watching, and wanting it not to succeed? To understand the moon landing conspiracy theory, we need to start with the backdrop. The 1960 space race was a duel between superpowers. The United States and the Soviet Union played out on the grandest stage imaginable, outer space. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy set a bold national goal. Before this decade is out, landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills.
At the same time, America had just one 15-minute human spaceflight under its belt. The challenge was immense and the stakes were high. The US poured an estimated $25 billion, over $150 billion in today's money, into Project Apollo, driven by the urgency to beat Soviets to the moon. From 1961 to 1969, NASA made rapid strides. Mercury, Gemini, and then Apollo flights building the experience to attempt a lunar landing. The endeavour was risky and it was expensive. The Apollo 1 disaster in 1967, where 3 astronauts died in a capsule flyer, grimly underscored the dangers.
This is a CBS News special report.
This is Mike Wallace at the CBS Newsroom in New York. America's first 3 Apollo astronauts were trapped and killed by a flash fire that swept their moonship early tonight during a launch pad test at Cape Kennedy in Florida.
But by 1969, Apollo 11 was ready. Its successful moon landing on July 20th was a stunning achievement that seemed to validate all of this effort, loss, and money. However, even at the height of Apollo's success, suspicion lurked in the shadows. The world was in the throes of a Cold War, an era of espionage, propaganda, and secrets. Trust in government was being eroded by Vietnam, and to some skeptics, it seemed plausible that NASA, or at least elements within the government, might cheat to win the most prestigious of victories. After all, if failure was likely or unacceptable, faking it could be an attractive contingency. Notably, the Soviet Union, America's rival, was tracking Apollo's mission closely. And this was always the thing that made me think that there was not really much to this. Surely, the Soviets, who were watching all of this unfold with satellites, telescopes, spy planes, everything, would have been the first to call bullshit if they hadn't landed on the moon. And yet, the Soviets stayed quiet. So can we account for that? Well, we'll discuss that a little bit later on. But in reality, the Soviets publicly acknowledged Apollo's 11 success. The authoritative Great Soviet Encyclopedia described Apollo 11's moon landing as a historic fact, and Soviet scientists never alleged it was a hoax. By By the early 1970s, the US had won the race to the moon. Apollo carried out 6 successful crewed landings from 69 to 72, yet as the moon missions wound down, whispers of conspiracy grew louder. In post-Apollo years, America turned inwards to deal with social upheavals and economic woes. NASA's budgets and momentum declined, and Apollo missions 18, 19 and 20 were cancelled due to funding cuts and waning public interest. To moon hoax believers, this was suspicious. They asked why, if we were so successful, would we suddenly stop going? Thus, Bill Kaysing's book became the lighter fluid to kick off this massive conspiracy which would continue on for decades and upset to no end not only the American government but NASA massively, and specifically a few of the astronauts who supposedly had landed on the moon.
Then I did an advert with Patrick Moore, and I said, "So, Patrick, did they land on the moon?" And he looked so annoyed with me.
Yeah.
He explained to me how he had helped map the moon for NASA, and he'd spent years on the project, and the landing site was partly his idea, and if I ever spoke to him again, he was going to be sick in my eyes.
By the 1990s, while the conspiracy had somewhat died down, it did maintain a low simmer, spread through word of mouth, self-published pamphlets, and the occasional media mention. Then, in the early 2000s, it erupted into popular culture once again. The Fox TV special, mentioned earlier, presented many of the classic hoax claims to a massive audience using slick editing and expert interviews. Suddenly, the agency found itself in the position of having to defend to a new generation one of its crowning achievements. In response, myth-busting articles and documentaries appeared, and even a special episode of the TV show Mythbusters was dedicated to testing moon hoax claims. Still, the genie was out of the bottle. More people, not fewer, were becoming skeptical of the moon landing. Thus, by the turn of the 21st century, the moon landing hoax had become a cultural phenomenon. So, was the moon landing real, or was it faked in a studio in Nevada with a shaky camera and a coffee budget? Either way, the government may be watching your search history after watching this video, and it's important to protect it. And that's where I use NordVPN. Yes, the eagle eye amongst you may have noticed that the camera has changed, the lighting has changed, the studio has changed, because this is indeed an ad read. NordVPN is the same tool that I use when digging through declassified files, conspiracy forums, or, watching totally normal YouTube videos about rocket propulsion. With NordVPN, your connection is encrypted and your data stays private. And you can access content from anywhere on Earth, even if that place isn't technically the moon. And right now, for Black Friday, yes, we're starting off this early, you can get up to 77% off with 3 months extra for free on a 2-year plan using my discount code. So before you go searching for Stanley Kubrick plus NASA plus 1969, be sure to click the link in the description below or simply go to nordvpn.com/Hassett to get this great deal. And now let's get back to the video. So what is the hoax based on? What is the evidence behind this? Well, we start that off with the evidence from the video footage and photographs which has been used over and over again over the years in order to tell the tale that this was shot on some sort of stage in the Nevada desert, for example, by Kubrick, Disney, and Arthur C. Clarke. When the Apollo 11 astronauts returned, NASA proudly released thousands of photographs and hours of footage documenting their journey. Ironically, these very records meant to prove the moon landing to the world had become a treasure trove for conspiracy theorists. Hoax proponents have spent decades poring over the images. Perhaps the iconic image of Apollo 11 is Buzz Aldrin standing next to the American flag planted in the lunar soil. Conspiracy theorists zoomed in on that flag and gasped. It appeared to be flapping in an unfelt breeze. In footage and still photographs, the flag's fabric is ripped, and in some videos it even moves. Skeptics argue that this should be impossible on a moon which has no atmosphere and therefore no wind. To them, the moving flag betrays the presence of air, maybe a draft on a soundstage or an indoor set where the scene was filmed. Some even claimed hidden fans were blowing to make the scene look more dramatic, or that an astronaut bumped the flag and it fluttered too long, as if blown by wind. And of course, if it was indeed blowing by wind, then it couldn't have been on the moon, which doesn't have wind. But of course, there were some simple counter-arguments to this to basically throw this simple theory into disarray. According to NASA and actual Apollo astronauts, the flag movement was not only explainable but expected in a vacuum. First, the flag wasn't an ordinary limp cloth flag. It had a horizontal crossbar along the top, forming an upside-down L-shaped flagpole to keep it extended. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin twisted the pole into the ground and adjusted the flag, it naturally caused the fabric to ripple. In the absence of air, those ripples weren't immediately dampened, given there was no air resistance. So the free corner of the flag swung like a pendulum for a while. This looks odd to our eyes used to Earth's wind, but it is exactly how undampened objects behave in a vacuum. It oscillates a bit and then comes to a rest. Video footage from Apollo 11 shows that once the astronaut lets go of the flagpole, its motion rapidly diminishes and it remains still. The waving is just momentum from being planted. Another famous claim is, surely if they were standing on the moon, there would have been some stars, which has caused Douglas Murray to ask the question, haven't you even been there? But it is a fair point. You're up out of the atmosphere in space where there is very little light pollution, and therefore surely you should be blinded by the glistening and mountain of stars. And conspiracy theories think that the stars were hidden in order to ensure that no constellation experts or star or astronomy experts, as they're known, could figure out the flaws in stars that they would say dot onto a soundstage roof. There is a slight issue with this though, and you may be aware of it. Something called daytime. Skeptics argue that space should have been brimming with stars visible from the moon's surface, yet the astronauts reported seeing none during their moonwalks. Conspiracists say that this is evidence that NASA filmed scenes on a dark soundstage and forgot to add stars to the fake backdrop. The absence of visible stars, though, in Apollo's photos is a matter of photography, biology, and not deception. The lunar surface, in daytime when the missions took place, was brightly lit by the sun. The astronauts wore suits and the moon's grey terrain reflected sunlight. Cameras were set with short exposure times and small apertures to capture the bright lunar surface without overexposure, essentially using daylight settings. Under those conditions, faint objects like stars simply don't register on film. It's the same reason you don't see stars in photos taken from the Space Shuttle or International Space Station in daylight. The cameras, or your eyes, are adjusted for bright objects, and the dimmer stars vanish in the glare. On the moon, all Apollo EVA photography was done during the lunar morning or afternoon. The sun was up. The sky is black only because there's no atmosphere to scatter the light, but the sun itself is just as bright as if it was viewed from Earth. So the astronauts' eyes were adapted to sunlit landscapes. In their visors, the surface and the equipment gleamed brightly. They could actually see stars only when they were not looking at sunlit scenes. For instance, some astronauts noted that when they stood in the shadow of the lunar module and gave their eyes a moment to adjust, a few stars popped into views. Photographically, NASA did have ways to capture stars. On Apollo 16, the astronauts carried a special ultraviolet camera that took long exposure photos of the star field from the moon's surface as an experiment. Those images do show stars. And again, this is one for me that I thought was a pretty reasonable explanation from the outset, in that, yes, if you go out in daytime, you're unlikely to see stars, even if you're looking at daytime on the moon. I mean, it's a very fair point. It is fair. Hoax proponents often analyze shadows in moon photos. They argue that some shadows don't run parallel, or that one astronaut is well lit while standing in another astronaut's shadow, or that the color or an angle of lighting seems inconsistent. For example, in certain Apollo 11 images, Buzz Aldrin is lit up even when he's in a shadowed area, leading conspiracists to suggest studio lighting was used, with fill lights or reflectors. The counter-argument to this, though, is that the moon's environment and photography explain these shadow oddities quite well. First, imagine the lunar surface. It's not a flat stage, but a rugged landscape with slopes, hills, and craters. Shadows will fall over uneven ground, causing foreshortening or lengthening that can make identical object shadows look different. Perspective plays tricks too. In wide-angle shots, parallel lines appear to converge due to perspective. Think of railroad tracks in a photo, they seem to meet at the horizon. So two shadows in the same sun can look non-parallel in a picture because of the camera angle and terrain. Moreover, the moon has multiple light sources in a sense, not artificial ones, but reflective ones. The sun is the primary source, yes, but the sunlight also bounces off the lunar surface, which, though grey, does reflect some light. This can then bounce off astronauts' white suits and off lunar surface's foil-covered body. On the moon, with no atmosphere, light isn't scattered in the air but does reflect strongly from surfaces. Apollo astronauts commented that the moon's ground was quite reflective under the sun. So in some photos, an astronaut standing in the shadow of the lunar module was still illuminated by the light reflecting off the moon's surface or another object. No Hollywood spotlights needed, just some basic physics. Which, I don't know, seems fair enough. I'm just waiting now for the comments on this video, which are going to be, I wonder how much NASA paid for this video to come out. And then there's what I call the game glitch theory, or the GTA theory, which is where they allege that various backgrounds were reused over and over again in the soundstage, and that's why most of the moon just looks the same. In Apollo's photograph catalogs, conspiracy theorists found pairs of images from different missions or different locations on the moon that show very similar hills or horizons in the background. For instance, on one set of Apollo 15 photos, they show a particular mountain on the horizon, and in another photo purportedly taken miles away at a different time shows an almost identical background. This caused skeptics to pounce. The counter-argument given by NASA and scientists, though, is that the moon's landscapes can indeed look deceptively similar. But that's due to geography, not optics, not recycling sets. On Earth, distant mountains or hills look hazy and diminished by our atmosphere. But on the moon, there's no atmosphere to add haze or a sense of depth. A mountain 5 miles away might look almost as crisp as one 1 mile away, especially to a camera. Also, without familiar landscapes like trees and buildings to gauge scale, our brains can misjudge distances on the moon. Apollo astronauts often noted that far-off features appeared closer than they were. So in photos, the background mountains remain the same over fairly large distances because astronauts didn't actually go that far from the landing site, a few kilometers at most. A hill on the horizon essentially stayed on the horizon from multiple viewpoints, hardly changing perspective, especially since lunar mountains are big. What conspiracists label identical backgrounds are actually the same real lunar feature photographed from slightly different angles, which to an untrained eye can look identical. Notably, NASA's photo indexes and mission transcripts back this up. When two photos have the same background, it's usually because they were taken during the same EVA. And I think that is a reasonable explanation when you think about it from a physics point of view. At the end of the day, the camera shots are not interrupted by the atmosphere or by that sense of scale in the way we get on Earth. It's an interesting one. I mean, but it could also be that the same guy just printed the same mountain twice. I've worked in a print shop before. These things happen. One of the strangest anomalies pointed out by hoax proponents, though, is the so-called sea rock. In a photo from an Apollo 16 mission, a rounded stone on the lunar ground appears to have the letter C neatly printed or embossed in it. Nearby on the ground, another C seems to be visible. For conspiracy theorists, this is the smoking gun evidence of a movie set. Props on stage are often labelled A, B, C, etc. for placement. And here, apparently a prop rock was mistakenly set on the set with the letter marking visible to the camera. The idea of prop rocks labelled C on the moon is undeniably tantalizing and has become a meme of the moon hoax theory. The C on the rock, though, is actually not on the rock at all. It's a quirk of photo processing. The original film negative and high-quality scans of Apollo 16 show no letter C on the rock. The mysterious C only appeared on certain prints of the image, likely due to hair or a fiber that got onto the photo during printing or copying. In older analog photo development, an errant thread on the printing plate can have the perfectly curved mark that might look like a letter. That's the consensus from photo analysts. The C was a printing imperfection, probably a hair or fiber that became persistent artifacts as copies were made afterwards. Once the suggestion of letters is in people's mind, it takes off. But NASA's archives have the clear original, and it shows the plain rock. No letter. But much like Epstein's jail photos, surely they could have edited the original negative. Because it's not the original negative. Right. That does make sense. I think they might have gone to the moon, you know. And there's also a variety of other elements in this from the videos that have sparked controversy over the years. For example, the missing camera question: who took the photo of Neil Armstrong stepping off the ladder onto the moon if he was the first man out? Conspiracists sometimes act as if this implies the cameraman was already there. In truth, a TV camera was mounted on the lunar modules and deployed before Armstrong descended. There's also the high quality photo galore theory, which is detractors have said that the astronauts supposedly took thousands of photos with some surprisingly well composed shots. Given they had limited training in photography and bulky gloves, they argue that the sheer number of great photos is implausible. And some images show what looks like bright spots in the center and darker vignetting at edges, which conspiracists claim is from a spotlight. In reality, this effect comes off the way lunar soil reflects light. So look, for me, the simple fact is, when it comes to the video evidence, that has always just been a bit of a difficult one for me to swallow, or to kind of get me to come over into the thinking that it was a hoax. And the simple reason for that is, if they are going to hoax this, they've got some of the best people in the world to do it. And you've got a guy like Stanley Kubrick allegedly, directing this. A guy that is obsessed with details. Similarly, you'd have Walt Disney there, obsessed with details. Similarly, you have Arthur C. Clarke there. And if it was hoaxed by all of these people in NASA, you've also got some of the best physicists in the world at the time. And the thinking is that these guys managed to leave the letter C on a rock. It just seems implausible. Or that they would forget to put the stars in, or in fact not get some people like cosmologists in who were experts that could map the stars out the way they wanted. That, to me, it makes it, if you're going to go to the effort of faking this, it seems to me like you'd be able to fake it properly. The thing that has made me think about this in the last while, though, has been some of the talk by some proper physicists about the Van Allen belt, for example. So some of the physics around the moon landing I find is more compelling in this story. Even if the photos and films were taken on the moon, skeptics argue that the trip itself was impossible or wildly unsafe in the 1960s. Encircling the Earth are zones of intense radiation known as the Van Allen radiation belts. Discovered in 1958 by Dr. James Van Allen, these donut-shaped belts trap charged particles from solar winds in Earth's magnetic field. It's true that these radiation belts can pose risks to astronauts. High-energy protons and electrons can damage cells or fog film. Moon hoax proponents argue that any crewed mission leaving Earth's orbit, as Apollo did, would have to pass through the Van Allen belts, and that radiation doses would have been lethally high. They often claim that to be safe, you'd need massive lead shielding, some literature even saying a figure of 6 feet of lead is cited. Something the lightweight Apollo spacecraft obviously didn't have. Some reference the 1962 high-altitude nuclear test, Starfish Prime, that energized the belts. suggesting the radiation was even more intense during Apollo. To hoax believers, sending astronauts through the Van Allen belt was a death trap. And yes, the Van Allen belts were there, but apparently they were well understood and managed by NASA. The key is that the level of radiation exposure Apollo astronauts got was significant, but not deadly. How? Well, three main factors: trajectory, shielding, and time. Apollo didn't fly straight through the thickest part of the belts. Instead, they took a trajectory that took the spacecraft through the belts fairly quickly and via a region where the radiation was much less intense. The belts have inner regions, which are more dangerous and full of high-energy protons, and outer regions that are mostly electrons. Apollo skimmed the inner belt at high speed in a matter of minutes, and then about 1.5 hours through the outer belt. Time spent was minimum, so the total dose absorbed was limited. Secondly, shielding. While Apollo didn't have lead walls, which would actually be counterproductive due to secondary radiation production, it did have the aluminium hull and other materials like plastic insulation that attenuated radiation. High-energy protons can be significantly reduced by a few millimeters of aluminium and the structure of the spacecraft. James Van Allen himself addressed this issue, noting that the calculated radiation dose Apollo 11 received was relatively modest, far below lethal thresholds. Indeed, Dr. Van Allen criticized those who said his belt was unsurvivable, pointing out that the average dose for Apollo was in the order of a few rads or centigrays, and modern analysis by astrophysicist Phil Plait indicates that the Apollo crew would have gotten under 1 rem. That's roughly comparable to a couple of CT scans or the additional cosmic radiation a frequent flyer might accumulate over years. Not trivial, but certainly not immediately harmful. It's also about the dose one might accumulate while living naturally on Earth for 3 years. In fact, the total mission dose for Apollo astronauts, including cosmic rays beyond the belts, was within the safety limits set for radiation workers, and actually not that much more than what space shuttle astronauts got on missions in low Earth orbit. And also, it should be noticed that NASA did a lot of inquiries into the Van Allen belt before Apollo went in. In its earlier Gemini missions, they skimmed one of their ships into the inner belt early on to gauge the radiation. They sent sensors up for radiation checks and so on. And checking for radiation in this nuclear age was nothing new and something that they would have expected in space anyway. So they were very much well prepared and had well analysed the radiation belts with earlier missions into space, like I said, with Gemini specifically. So I'd be interested to hear from scientists who are against this, but from what I can find, it seems like the radiation, as long as you don't stick for long amounts of time in the high proton areas, is well within the limits of human survivability. One of the other claims, though, is that there should have been a much larger blast crater left by the Apollo missions. When the Apollo lunar module landed on the moon, its throttleable descent rocket engine was firing to slow it down. Conspiracy theorists expect that this engine, producing up to 10,000 pounds of thrust, would blast a large crater in the lunar soil upon landing, yet photos of the Apollo landing site show no large blast hole under the lander. The LM's foot pads rest on the surface with just a light dusting of megalith around. Hoax proponents argue that on a dusty moon, the real descent would have scourged the area, blown all the dust away and left a deep crater or scorch mark. But this is another case where intuition misleads us. We imagine that a rocket like those on Earth dig into the ground. But the physics on the moon and the designs of the LM's landing tell a different story. No significant crater was expected under the lunar module, and here's why. First, by the time the LM reached near the surface, it wasn't using anything close to full thrust. In fact, the descent engine was throttled way down in the final moments. The LM had already shed most of its velocity, and it was in a semi-hover to find a spot. At touchdown, the engine needed only to support the craft's weight in lunar gravity, which is 1/6 of Earth's, and the LM was almost all out of fuel, meaning it was much lighter than at ignition. Calculations show that at landing, the engine's thrust divided by the nozzle area, essentially the pressure exerted on the ground, was only an order of 1.5 psi, pounds per square inch. That's about the pressure of a gentle breath spread out. Not exactly the gouging jackhammer one might expect. Additionally, as soon as the contact probes touched the lunar surface, astronauts cut the engines off, so it wasn't even firing at full power all the way to the ground. Neil Armstrong did exactly this on Apollo 11. The engine was shut off a few feet before the surface, and the LM free fell the last instant, a planned maneuver, which actually reduces the blasting effect. Notably, there's also vacuum behavior. In a vacuum, rocket exhausts expand rapidly after exiting the nozzle, and there's no air to contain or shape the plume. On Earth, rocket flames appear narrow and fiery because air compresses them. As the Saturn V goes higher, its exhaust plume widens dramatically due to thinning air. On the Moon, the LM's exhaust spread out wide, not a tight jet digging in. By the time the exhaust reached the ground, its pressure was much lower and diffused over a broad area. The top layer of the Moon is fine dust, but beneath a few centimeters, it is very compacted. It's hard soil. Micrometeorite impacts tend to pack it over billions of years. The Apollo landers found a thin layer of dust, a couple of inches, over a hard pan of regolith. So when the descent engine blew away some of the loose dust, it quickly hit hard surface, which doesn't easily erode. And some might say the footprints versus engine seem contradicting. The answer is scale and force. An astronaut's boot is small, exerting pressure enough to compress the dust and leave a print. The LM foot pads were broad, nearly 3 feet wide, and the weight of the LM is spread over them in lunar gravity was about 2,700 pounds total. Divided among 4 legs and factoring pad area, the pressure was actually not enormous. That's why the pads didn't leave massive imprints, but the boots left a long-lasting effect. And this effect of, gauging down the amount of thrust and kind of free-falling the last while, as well as everything spreading, also explains why there was no really highly notable scorch marks on the surface, because by the time they got to the surface, there was nothing to scorch it. It seems like a reasonable observation from a physics point of view, even for someone with a reasonable grasp of physics. Beyond physics, though, there is one big outcry: the lost telemetry. Beyond physics, conspiracy theorists often hint at a broader cover-up by pointing out NASA's loss of certain Apollo-era data. One infamous example is the Apollo 11 telemetry tapes that in the mid-2000s news emerged NASA could not locate, or at least they couldn't locate the high-quality original magnetic tapes. This seemed suspicious. How do you lose the tapes of the greatest achievement of mankind? Well, the case of the missing Apollo 11 tapes is embarrassing for NASA, but the mundane truth seems to be more grounded in bureaucratic mismanagement than conspiracy. Apollo 11's live television from the moon was broadcast worldwide by converting a special slow scan signal, 320 lines at 10 FPS, to standard TV format in real time. The raw slow scan data, along with telemetry, was recorded at tracking stations onto 1-inch magnetic tapes. These tapes were stored after Apollo, but by the 1980s, magnetic tape was a scarce resource. NASA, facing budget constraints, likely erased and reused many Apollo-era tapes for later. In 2006, when some former Apollo personnel and enthusiasts sought to find Apollo 11 SSTV tapes, NASA initially searched. The result, documented in 2009, was the conclusion that around 45 tapes were probably erased and reused in the 70s. They simply hadn't realized the historic value at the time. Once the TV broadcast was copied onto kinescope and NTSC tapes, the raw data tape was just considered redundant storage. And NASA did preserve copies of the Apollo 11 landing video. The familiar grainy footage exists because it was recorded off monitors and on broadcast tapes which were kept. NASA even hired companies to digitally restore the best existing footage since the originals were gone. They were even quite open about this process, which is a strange thing to do if you're trying to hide a hoax. While it's regrettable that the original moon landing video is lost due to recycling, all the data wasn't lost to science. We have the films, the transcripts, the samples, etc. Conspiracy theorists say, how can we lose that tech? And it wasn't only the Apollo missions that were lost this way either. Saturn V blueprints, for example, which were stored on microfilm tapes, were lost as well. But they were only lost because they were overwritten almost purposely, almost as an afterthought, because NASA knew they wouldn't be using those same designs again because they had already gone on to build better and newer ones. So unfortunately, it does seem like while this seems odd, it is done inside governments quite a bit. They will reuse things for cost, and genuinely governments, I think we all agree, are not the most efficient or smartest outfits when it comes to thinking long term.
And the other thing with the mirrors that Apollo 12 astronauts put on the moon, which are now used for bouncing lasers off, for detecting, for example, how far the moon is getting away from us. And you can make incredibly accurate measurements because of mirrors on the surface of the moon.
But let's indulge for a moment that this was faked. If NASA didn't actually pull off a moon landing, how would they have faked it? One of the most cinematic versions of the hoax theory is that Stanley Kubrick, fresh off directing 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968, was secretly hired by NASA to film the fake moon landing. As the story goes, and it has many variations, Kubrick's mastery of special effects convinced the government that he could create a believable moon environment on film, a common outline. NASA would launch the Saturn V rocket as a cover so observers see something going up. The astronauts would either be in on it or sent to orbit to broadcast pre-filmed moon footage, and Kubrick's meticulously crafted scenes would be fed to the world as live telegraphs from the lunar surface. The astronauts would then return in their capsule, splashing down, completing the illusion. The theory got a boost from a mockumentary, a fake documentary in 2002 called Dark Side of the Moon, which tongue-in-cheek suggested Kubrick confessed to staging Apollo. Some viewers missed the satire and took it as real. There was zero actual evidence, though, that Kubrick was involved, and quite a lot against it. For starters, Kubrick was a notorious perfectionist and truth-seeker personality-wise. The idea of him perpetrating a massive lie on humanity doesn't really fit. But more concretely, Kubrick's 2001 movie, while groundbreaking, did not look a lot like Apollo. The moon scenes in 2001 differ in lighting and moving to the Apollo missions. Analysis note, for example, the way astronauts move in Apollo, hopping in low gravity, kicking up dust that falls quickly, wasn't replicated in Kubrick's films, which was made before Apollo and used wires and slow-motion lunar scenes, techniques that result in subtle differences. If Kubrick had known how to fake Apollo so perfectly, then why wouldn't he have used this for his own scenes? There's also the practical matter. Space Odyssey had huge sets and cost a fortune for minutes of moon footage. Faking an entire moon mission worth of video, audio, and still photography with 1960s technology would have been a Herculean production, and to do it in absolute secrecy. Kubrick was indeed contracted by NASA, but for consultation on making space footage better, not to direct hoaxes, or at least so the legend goes. He borrowed a special camera lens from NASA for his film Barry Lyndon in the 1970s, which is sometimes oddly cited as evidence of a connection. Really, it was just a fast lens NASA had developed with Zeiss. The whole Kubrick story actually originated from a satirical article in 1995, jokingly detailing how Kubrick was coerced to film Apollo with a fictitious brother as leverage. Many conspiracists took it as fake value, not realizing it was a parody. And it should be noted that Kubrick died in 1999 without leaving any sort of deathbed confession, which you would have expected in that situation. Let's set Kubrick aside for a moment though, and imagine NASA doing it internally. There would have been a way to simulate low gravity, maybe slow motion filming and hidden wires on astronauts. Indeed, conspiracists have pointed to footage that they think shows astronauts yanked upright as if on wires when they fall, or that they claim dust doesn't fall right. You'd need to handle communications. The astronauts' radio chatter and biometric data were received by tracking stations around the world, including facilities not under NASA's direct control, like in Spain and Australia. A fake would require either fooling those operations or having them in on it. Don't forget that thousands of engineers and contractors who built the Saturn V and Apollo spacecrafts managed the flights in mission control, and many of them would needed to have been in on the cover-up, or at least not realize that this data was being simulated. The scale of the operation balloons quickly when you go down this rabbit hole. Estimates vary, but Apollo involved 400,000 people in total over the decade: scientists, engineers, techs, and contractors. The counter-argument from conspiracists is usually not all 400,000 people would need to know. Maybe only a core few dozen who had plotted it. Perhaps, but consider this. The astronauts themselves, 33 Apollo astronauts in total, including 12 who walked on the moon, would definitely know. Mission control heads, flight directors, key engineers monitoring telemetry would know something was off. The tracking station staff in Australia and Spain, unless the signals were somehow perfectly spoofed, would know. The recovery ship crew that picked up the astronauts would see that they were re-entering from orbit versus the moon. Re-entry from the moon is faster. The Soviet Union's monitoring network is another big problem. They surely weren't in on it, and they heard Apollo's transmission and tracked spacecrafts. And as noted earlier, the Soviets never once came out claiming that this was a hoax. And they would have loved to if there was any hint of one. Historically, big conspiracies involving hundreds of people tend to leak. As one NASA official quipped, if Apollo was a hoax, it was the best kept secret in history. But decades later, no NASA employee or Apollo astronaut has come out and said it was fake. And in fact, quite the opposite. Famously, Buzz Aldrin, an Apollo astronaut who walked on the moon, punched a conspiracy theorist, Bart Siebel, in the face for simply saying it was one. Basically, you would have to have quite a few people in on this, and the secrecy levels that you would need to have are above and beyond for something that is kept in the public eye. Conversely, the JFK cover-up could be held by quite a small, relatively amount of people who were already trained at keeping secrets, some of whom who've blatantly outright said that they did it, like the mafia, for example. However, the moon landing would need to be hidden from people on a grand scale. And it's a situation where it's done so openly that NASA engineers would have been scrutinized by the enemy on the other side, as I said, the Soviets. So I think the only thing that would tilt me into thinking that it was faked is if it turns out that the Van Allen calculations have been wrong, and it would be as hard as some have said that it would take to get through it. Perhaps in that case, we could concretely say that maybe it was a situation where a handful of people were in on it and they faked it so brilliantly. The one thing I will say though, if there was a time to keep something secret, this was the time. These were thousands of patriotic engineers fighting against the communists I mentioned earlier. So while I do think that it is ridiculously difficult to keep this public of a secret with so many people involved, I do concede that this would be the one time with the one ideology that you could keep it secret, given the time, the anti-communism that was in it and so on. But there's just nothing so far that has swayed me to think that the most likely conclusion is that it was hoaxed. For me, the most likely conclusion is that it was done for real, but I am open to be proven wrong. I just haven't been so far as I'm concerned anyway. That said, I have very much been convinced that conspiracy theories are real. And there is one other conspiracy theory that I have bought into because the evidence seems to be getting overwhelming.
Whistling Dixie. I want this sent to Area 51 for study.
But, sir, that's where we're building the fake moon landing set.
Then we'll have to really land on the moon. Invent NASA and tell them to get off their fannies.